I am Shirley Gilbert. I'm Professor of Modern Jewish History at University College London. And I'm also, as many of you will know, the director of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, which was established in memory of the late British historian. And I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you to today's talk. Given the subject of Zionism and Jewish nationhood, it feels very important to acknowledge the war that is continuing to unfold in Israel and Gaza, and that we continue to pray for the speedy return of hostages and for the safety of all innocent civilians. Sir Martin was, of course, the official biographer of Sir Winston Churchill. He also published many, many studies on modern Jewish history, the Holocaust, and Israel, among many other topics. And so the centre's aim is to perpetuate his work, to bring the finest historical research to a broad, non-academic public. So for those of you who haven't come to one of our talks before, in addition to these kinds of public programs, we also work with secondary school teachers here in the UK to provide resources and lessons that draw on primary source materials, often archival materials, and the latest historical scholarship. As always, I will also remind you that donations are very easy to make on our website. And as a small charity, we really rely on your donations, however big or small they are, so that we can keep all of our events free and reach a really wide public. So thank you very much in advance. I'm really delighted today to be able to introduce to you one of our up-and-coming young scholars in the field of Jewish history, Dr. Rebekka Grossmann. Rebekka is Assistant Professor of Migration History at Leiden University, which is a new permanent post that she's taken up just this September, having been in Israel previously. Her research focuses on the intersections of international Jewish politics, visual culture, and migration, and is really fascinating. Her first book is currently under review, and it's titled Unsettled Cameras: Photography, Mobility, and Nation in Jewish History, 1918 to 1948. And in her talk tonight, she's going to be drawing directly on the research from her book. She will be talking for about 40 minutes. After that, as usual, we'll have the opportunity to hear your questions and comments. Feel free to post those either in the chat to everyone, or you can send me a private message, and I'll be very happy to relay that question to Rebekka. So without any further ado, I will pass on to Rebekka for her talk, which is titled Circulating Zion: Global Photojournalism and the Making of a Jewish Nation. Rebekka.
Thank you very much. And I will be sharing my screen. 1 second. And you can all hear me. Okay, good. Yeah, so thank you very much, Shirley, for this kind introduction and also for the invitation. And thanks everyone for being here tonight with me. I am delighted that I can present my research here at the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre online. And when we planned this talk, we did, of course, not know what difficult times would await us this fall. But I also think that we can use these weeks and very difficult months as a time of learning and exchange, maybe about some of the historical roots of the point we have reached, and also about what this might mean for us for the future, for Israel. I myself certainly see how the questions that are driving me in my research have gained even more urgency in recent weeks. My work centers on the question of representations, of appearances that a nation creates of itself, and also appearances that others create of it. And I think we can all agree that each war, and including this one now, is also a war of images. I am a historian by training, and what drove me in my research was the fascination with image politics in Jewish history. Which images make a nation? Which images made the Jewish nation in particular? What did the origins of Jewish public relations look like? And I can start with a slight spoiler. Politics made through images are in no way a recent phenomenon. In fact, politics through images have been as old as Zionism itself. And more than that, visual culture actually played an important role in Jewish nation building. And I think that recently you had the chance to listen to my former teacher, Professor Derek Penslar, who talked about the emotions connected to Jewish nation building. Today, I'll be talking about the images, visual images that fuel such emotions or that were the product thereof. I would like to take you back to the beginnings of the question of how images made politics in the history of Jewish nationalism. And I will start with a bit of a broader introduction and will then focus on the topic of images of Zionism and Mandate Palestine, in particular in global photojournalism. So Zionist politics was concerned with international attention early on. Propaganda and particularly agitation, these words were important buzzwords during the first congresses, where speakers called for means and activities to enlighten audiences about the aims of their Zionist movement. Among the prime tools to raise attention would be official public speakers, for example, but also debates, clubs, and particularly publications of various kinds, but also visual arts, which Martin Buber, one of the more prominent participants of these first years, called, quote, a most important means of propaganda. And I found here an image of Buber, the way he looked like when he actually attended one of those first congresses, not so much the Martin Buber that we maybe remember, and more like older person. Accordingly, he called for the collection, preservation, and distribution of images, and its new awareness for the importance of a political presence through the circulation of information. This Zionist movement, this young Zionist movement, was inspired by the growing excitement for the power of news. Major actors in this attempt to gain attention were first the Jewish National Fund, which was founded in the beginning of the 20th century, and then also the Keren Hayesod, the Palestine Foundation Fund, founded in 1921. But while both were occupied with the question of how to teach the world about Zionism, none of them succeeded to produce or circulate a clear image of what a Jewish nation was to look like, especially not to non-Jews. And we understand from the different correspondences between these different agents in the institutions that the question was itself a point of contention. What was Palestine? What was Jewish Palestine to look like? Which images were to be created? Which images were to be circulated? These things changed in many ways with the first large clashes between Jews and Arabs in Palestine in the year 1929, which received an unprecedented amount of international attention, including in the international news. So both in the national and in the international news, we have here a page from a paper, Doar Hayom, from the 10th of September 1929, which actually shows us an image of the atrocities. And luckily, we can't really see much because of the poor printing quality. But these were images that were used in the national press, images of atrocities. Zionist officials in the national institutions that I have just mentioned, the Keren Hayesod and the Keren Kayemet, were reluctant to use such images of the national clashes as an opportunity to boost the Yeshuv's international profile. They were not interested in using these images. Instead, they wanted to have images taken that would be able to send a more positive picture abroad. And so they were on the lookout for other photographers painting a less cruel and more positive image, in like diverting the gaze towards maybe some of the positive aspects of Jewish life in Palestine in spite of these clashes. One of the journalists who heard about the clashes and decided to travel to Palestine to report about what was happening was the German Jewish photographer Tim Gidal. The 21-year-old Gidal had just started working as a freelance photojournalist a year earlier around Munich. That's where he came from, but he could convince different German and French illustrated papers to sponsor his trip to Palestine, during which he promised to take photographs that would then be able to enlighten audiences at home and generally in Europe about this new situation in the Middle East. Gidal prepared for his trip by getting in touch with the Zionist office in Berlin, asking for some ideas on how and where to travel. This, of course, was just what the public relations agents of the Zionist institutions had waited for. One of them, the representative in Berlin, Ernst Mechner, who received Gidal at his offices, immediately turned to his colleagues in Jerusalem and advised them to guide Gidal through the country and only show him places whose depiction would be of advantage for the presentation of Zionism abroad. And we see here on the slide this letter that he wrote to his colleagues in Jerusalem saying, please make sure that he only sees things that are of advantage for us, the Zionist movement, that are of advantage for the general image of the Yishuv abroad. And so interactions of this kind show that some people in the Zionist funds very closely followed the changes happening to global journalism and were actively trying to influence what was shown and written about them abroad. One of the papers that had funded the work of the photographer Tim Gidal and his trip was the Munich Illustrated Press, the second most popular national illustrated newspaper in Germany at the time, which counted around 700,000 readers from all across Germany. The Munich Illustrated Press printed an article with images of Gidal that they titled "The Core Question of the National Jewish Homestead in Palestine: Arabs Against Jews." And they offered to explain, as Gidal had envisioned it, the current state of affairs in Palestine to German readers. The article opens with a British soldier's profile picture in the upper right corner of the page, of the first page, presenting Britain as a major political player in Palestine. The figure of the British soldier in the article is one of positive authority. He has a strict look and he wears a large helmet and also has his bayonet standing next to him, which is raised high into the air, and he surveys the scene. His eyes, in a way, are directed against the headline that reads "Arabs Against Jews." The bright plate of the bayonet seems to somewhat divide his own figure into two pieces, as if to allude to his divided loyalties in the East, and we can assume that there is some reason that this picture is here on the top of the page, because editors, and I will say a bit more later about that, were very much aware of the effect that photographs had. And so we can assume, or we can be pretty sure, that not much here is left to chance, and that things here are chosen very much with an intention. The accompanying text confirms the photographic impression by stating that the British presence was, quote, the sole guarantor for peace in Palestine. The two subsequent photographs demonstrate why Palestine is in need for such guarantors of peace. One of them is a smaller photograph in the center of the page, which shows a group of horses, which, as readers are told here in the caption, are a, quote, cause for conflicts, as the ceaseless Arab horse thefts on Jewish farms affect bloody clashes, end of quote. And then a third perspective, both in a literal and in a metaphorical sense, on life in Palestine is given by means of a large aerial photograph of the Jewish settlement of Nahalal, appearing on the bottom of that page. It suggests, in combination with the previous topic of the horse thefts, that there is a certain mastery that the Zionist movement has brought to the land. We see the image from above, which gives us an impression of control and of, kind of surveillance in a similar way to the British soldier. Another interesting element here of this page is that only the British soldier is appearing as a real person, while the other two groups that play a role in Palestine are appearing in the form of symbols, either the land or these horses, which remind apparently or allegedly of horse thefts. The text corroborates the visual impression of a clash of cultures by explaining, quote, this contrast between Jews and Arabs is the natural contrast between Occident and Orient. Taken together, the page offered a clear positioning in favor of a certain Western cooperation between British law and order and Zionism productively transforming the land. Jewish here is presented as a synonym for modern. This also shows us that the kind of anti-Semitism that has found entrance into German society has not yet entered the mainstream press at the time, and that Zionist views were able to be conveyed to a large readership. The first page was then followed by a second offering more ideological perspectives of a very similar kind into a Jewish Palestine. So again, there is a much larger focus on Jewish life than, for example, on Arab life. The article introduces Palestine as a political space. It is not the timeless Orient anymore, as which it has appeared so far in illustrated travelogues or in photo books. It is now presented as a country that is inhabited by three groups, of whom two are claiming national privileges and one is to offer mediation. This is how it's being presented. And since the British were a European colonial power, this article also clearly presents the European involvement in this national conflict. The way Palestine's Jews were shown was not Gedal's doing alone, but happened in cooperation with the paper's editor, who was Stefan Lorand. Editors were important middlemen and women between photographers and audiences at the time, and they are until today, in fact. Stefan Lorand was one of those first editors, very much influencing the way illustrated newspapers worked. His aspiration was to educate readers through what he called photographic seeing by carefully curating his essays and thus offering a particularly immersive way of reading, as he believed it. Some of you might have heard of him, as he also worked in Britain for some time, and I will mention him later again today because he does play a very important role in the story about the depiction of Jewish Palestine in the 1930s. Illustrated newspapers had emerged only recently as a mass-scale product, but they boosted the importance of photography as both news and commodity. This was no uncontroversial development. On the one hand, there were those who claimed that photo essays could reduce the complexity of difficult topics by giving readers a new ability for photographic seeing. But on the other hand, there were cultural critics, such as Siegfried Krakow, for example, who condemned photojournalism for merely reproducing the world and also overwhelming it with a flood of easily replaceable images. And indeed, illustrated newspapers did have a peculiar approach to news. They printed them, but mixed them with all sorts of less political images, including fashion themes, serial stories, and then also a lot of advertising. And that mix of ads and interest stories helped to blur the lines of readers between news and consumption. So the article on Palestine, for example, drowned in advertisements for cigarettes, for pasta, but then also for tea or BMW cars. So yeah, this meant that Palestine could be sold in a way to the world, and Zionism could become a commodity marketed through photography. But Zionist public relations agents in Europe and Jerusalem saw this actually with much satisfaction. And they did everything to push the circulation of images. For them, this meant that the more images are out there, the better it is for them. Moreover, they understood that next to photographers and editors, news agencies played a particularly important role in this, and they tried to create their own agencies for image circulation. In the 1920s, there had already been several attempts to do this, but they were not very successful for various reasons. For example, they didn't have enough connections, but photojournalism was also not at this point where it was so successful as it was in the 1930s. In the mid-1930s, however, a news agency was created in Mandate, Palestine that would ultimately also help circulate their images globally. And the name of this agency was PALCOR, which is an acronym of the words Palestine and Correspondence. PALCOR was a 1934 creation of the Jewish Agency Executive in response to political clashes with the other international supplier of Jewish news, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Relations between Zionist public administrators in Jerusalem and the Jewish Telegraphic Agency were difficult for a long time already, up to this point in the mid-1930s, because the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the JTA, was regularly under scrutiny in Palestine for its either very meager or then also mediocre reporting about Zionism and Palestine, and ultimately it was also blamed for its revisionist stance, or at least the revisionist stance of some of its correspondents. When these reproaches accumulated in the wake of the arguably very tendentious reporting about the murder of Chaim Arlosoroff, the Zionist executive decided to found its own agency and to cut ties with the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And that their own agency was PALCOR. And so from 1934, PALCOR began to circulate its own news from Palestine as the official news organ of the Jewish community. As such, it was also responsible for the circulation of images, and it actually managed to place images in a very important magazine, the newly founded American Life magazine. And not only a few images, but actually Life dedicated a full article to Palestine in the summer of 1937. Appearing in Life magazine was a very big deal for the makers of Zionist images at the time. And I want to dwell a bit on why this was the case. So first of all, Life magazine had just been founded in November 1936, but within months, it had become America's #1 illustrated news outlet. By April 1937, the magazine was distributing over 1 million copies, and 1 year later, numbers had already doubled. So photographs and texts in Life magazine were always printed closely together, and that was inspired, among other things, in particular by Weimar German illustrated papers of the kind, for example, that Stefan Lorand had represented. And Life magazine also employed various German Jewish exiles in the 1930s. Palestine's appearance in Life was in July 1937, and we see here the cover image, which shows us that this is very much a summer issue. The cover image is by Dorothea Lange, who was a very famous photographer already by then, but the motif, those corn spikes are also showing us that this is summer, and this issue might lack a more important theme for their cover image. But we have the article on Palestine in it, which began with a double-page spread showing a Jewish farmer in the upper left corner, complemented by a picture of a woman preparing the soil with a horse-drawn plow. And these two pictures introduced the article with the words, "Jews from the world's cities now farm Palestine." The opposite page provides some geographic context by displaying 2 aerial photographs. The first shows the wild and wiggling Jordan, and that then is contrasted by yet another image of Nahalal, which by then has really become sort of a symbol of Jewish settlement in Palestine, and also very much of Jewish innovation and the innovation of agriculture in the land. We also see a plane flying over the Jordan, which also in this regard is kind of visually tamed by us being able to surveil it, to observe what's going on in the country. And the viewers are being invited on this kind of plane, this ride. we see pictures from above, they always give us an impression of control. The introductory text first pays tribute to Zionist Jews, but it also gives a feeling of a large distance between Zionist ideas and American audiences. The text calls Jews a, quote, race supremely adaptable to city civilization, end of quote, and it praises them for taking on the challenge of colonizing a country like Palestine. The picture shows Zionist achievements, but the racialized texts mock the Zionist endeavor by hinting at the Jews' lack of consideration for local mores or the climate, and predict that, quote, the Jews' unwise dress in the sun is having a bad physical and nervous effect on the colonists as a whole. And then the conflict between Jews and Arabs was called a vendetta between Jews and Arabs, and was declared, quote, absurd as both are Semitic. In line with the general character of the magazine, which was to offer light entertainment, the article seemed to want to both address the presence of Jews in Palestine and the respective national conflict. At the same time, it belittled Palestine's importance for American readers by settling for very simplistic explanations for the simmering national conflict. The following pages continue in this vein of a dissonance between images and texts. On the one hand, we see Tel Aviv with impressions of bustling city life and the beach and the Levant Fair, for example. But then we have texts that continue to offer racialized explanations for ignorant readers. For example, the text speaks of a city that has high numbers of, quote, nightclubs, prostitutes, or venereal disease, and the city is generally characterized as immoral. And this then finds sort of its climax when the author bemoans the city's, quote, larceny and a great deal of usury, end of quote. So we see that major anti-Semitic stereotypes unite here on these pages and are extended also to Palestine's Arab inhabitants on the following pages, which are, given similar descriptions. The British are presented as incapable imperialists trying but not succeeding to maintain peace in the region. So everything is very different from the article that we've seen before that was edited by Stefan Laurent. Generally, we get a feeling that American editors or readers did not know exactly what to do with the idea of a Jewish homestead in Palestine, and that if it was considered to be of use for something, then it was mainly just that it fostered national coherence at home by presenting the American people more advanced, more civilized, and life in America generally as much better. Jews were granted some potential to civilize the region, but were presented as largely idealistic and naive, and they could also not really be trusted, according to the texts. It can be assumed that this Palkor and Jewish Telegraphic Agency controversy, which I mentioned before, influenced this very independent reading of the images by the editors, because the US were JTA to run, and the JTA wasn't very interested in fostering Zionism among readers, and so they also didn't really help editors read these images. At least we can see that after that, relations between Palkor and the JTA became better again. The way Palestine was presented in Life magazine and other news outlets occupied Zionist administrators back in Jerusalem, and they tried to influence the reporting of those they were in direct touch with. And one of these editors continued to be the editor Stefan Laurent, who in turn stayed in touch with Tim Vidal. One step that Stefan Laurent, or a very important step that Stefan Laurent had taken, was his move to London, where he founded different illustrated newspapers, including the Weekly Illustrated and later the magazines Lilliput and Picture Post. As a German Jew and editor-in-chief of one of the most liberal newspapers at the time, he had been persecuted very early on in Germany, which he left in 1933, after being imprisoned there for 6 months. The photographer Vidal had moved to Palestine, where he tried to make a living as freelance photographer, sending images to various editors abroad, including to his old acquaintance, Stefan Laurent. So we have another article that the two of them created together now in the picture post of November 5th, 1938, which was titled War in the Holy Land. And this article showed the ongoing clashes through photographs of British measures taken against Arab criminal offenses. And the title, War in the Holy Land, was reminiscent of Laurent's 1930 headline, Arabs Against Jews. The accompanying text starts with a rhetorical question: why are we in Palestine? Followed by an answer for British readers on the historical origins of the Palestine Mandate. Laurent's impression was that not very much was known in Britain about Palestine, and he sought to help readers understand the conflict in a similar way that he had sought to enlighten German readers in the beginning of the decade. This article, in contrast, pulled readers into the immediate presence of the clashes. We see now British soldiers that are shown in action. They keep order in the Holy Land when they search suspects, blow up houses, or lead captives out of the old city. And then we also have these small objects that are supposed to create ties between British readers and the soldiers in Palestine. For example, we have this box, if you can see on the right side, of Heinz baked beans, which clearly serves as a key between readers and their soldiers abroad, sort of a tie that links between them. The reporting seemed to aim at ensuring that British readers had a favorable view not only of the British presence in Palestine, but also of the shared aims with Palestine's Jews, who were presented as suffering, like the British soldiers, from Arab aggressions. Trying to present the Jewish position in a favorable light was also a portrait series on the second and third pages, which was to create a conversation between Palestine's inhabitants. What the series did was to confront an Arab inhabitant of the land with various non-Arab counterparts. In a short statement with the title, The Arab Speaks, under his portrait, he was presented as claiming that he was not ready to accept Jewish immigration. His figure was juxtaposed with a group of portraits of 11 mainly Jewish immigrants. And underneath them, there are short texts that are not explaining, not speaking, but replying, assuring readers of their good intentions as peaceful cohabitants with the Arab dwellers. So we have various elements that show them as much more cooperative than this Arab person who is merely presenting his opinion. Women are missing from this panorama, potentially because they lack the authoritative power to explain things, but also because they might have reminded readers that this was a conflict that was very violent and that also concerned women and children, which might actually have created criticism from the side of the readers. Back in Jerusalem, Zionist public relations agents very closely followed the coverage and distributed immediate feedback on what happened, and including the picture post article. So for example, Tim Gidal received a complaint from them after this article appeared that the texts underneath these photographs that we are seeing here were too weak and unable to represent the stance of Palestine's Jewish inhabitants convincingly. At the same time, they were still happy that Gidal was able to show not only pictures of the conflict, and informed him that they would transfer him 5 Palestine pounds for the contribution these images had offered to Zionist public relations. So it was a very close observation of what was going on in the international press. The interaction shows that Zionist public relations experts believed to be able to immediately influence the Yeshuv's presentation abroad. The picture post was considered a particularly important news organ, even if for the future it was hoped that it would bring pictures that would focus even less on the conflict. So we really start understanding that even in the very early years of global image circulation, the picture that was painted of Jewish Palestine abroad was a result of a multitude of agents, and was ultimately, that's also what these public relations agents saw in Jerusalem, was ultimately very difficult to orchestrate and to manage and to influence. A particularly aggressive stance of showing Palestine was chosen, not surprisingly, by Nazi Germany, whose press was eager to use the Zionist presence in Palestine for their own anti-Semitic politics and paternalize Palestine's Arab inhabitants. Zionism was a topic in the Nazi press from the beginning, and the respective views were shaped by ideas based on racial ideologies formulated by various figures, including, for example, Alfred Rosenberg. With the years, Palestine became an essential element of Germany's anti-Jewish and anti-British image propaganda. And while initially German editors were asked not to rely on foreign press material, the prospect of showing Germans that they could have the news from all over the world and were continuing to be very well connected was too attractive to just withdraw to provincial photojournalistic news. So they continued very much to get images from abroad, but lots of times they just used images that they, for example, found in other journals and magazines and newspapers, and appropriated them and reinterpreted them. So this is what happened, for example, with this image here, which was taken by Rudi Weissenstein, originally appeared in the Jüdische Rundschau in July 1938, where it was to show the harvest in the Jezreel Valley. And in this case, a few weeks later, the same image is being taken by a Nazi German editor and printed in the Nationalsozialistische Landpost, which was a farmers' newspaper, to show German farmers that allegedly Jews are not able to be real farmers because they are dancing around this combine or next to this combine instead of the fruit of the harvest, which is of course the logical thing to do in the eyes of this editor, trying to redirect the reading of this image. In other instances, images were consciously distorted in attempts to twist their meaning, as happened, for example, in an article that was part of a series that that appeared in the newspaper Der Arbeitsmann in the weeks of late 1938 and early 1939. It was titled "Grasping for Palestine, a factual report on the intrigues of the Jews over the Holy Land," and was to explain Palestine's role and status to the readers. And so what happened here instead of the other example was that two images in the last issue were the same pictures visible in the Picture Post article mentioned above, which had printed photographs of Tim Gidal. But here we see a distortion of this image. The image has been cut into two pieces. And this act of cropping and reframing of this original image of Gidal kind of doubles the event. We have now two events in a way, because we have two pictures. We don't know that they're actually the same event. And then the same manipulation also changed, for example, the quota of British soldiers. We have now one or two British soldier for each Arab, which seems more threatening and menacing. We also have less of a context. This could have happened anywhere, and is thus thought of happening more frequently. And then also, for example, these objects, like we talked about, like the Heinz baked beans box is clearly missing in order to avoid any kind of missing or any kind of link that might have rendered these British soldiers more human. The interpretation and the implications of the scene for readers differed considerably from that in the British paper. The transformation of the Orient they exemplified might have been cumbersome for both British and German audiences, but German readers were meant to see them as part of a larger, as part of a global threat. And British readers were invited by the émigré editor Laurent to see them as yet another step towards the modernization of the world, spearheaded by British humanistic advances. And it is, of course, also no coincidence that such an article in the German paper appeared in very close temporal proximity to the events of November 9th and 10th, 1938 in Germany, justifying domestic acts against Jews with news about the Jewish threat from abroad. Once more here, Palestine was helping to make domestic politics. Photographs appearing in the Nazi German press were not commented on by the Zionist public relations agents in Jerusalem to the extent other articles were, probably because the direct link between photographers and editors was missing here. But some of the criticism of the circulated photographs also concerned the ways Palestine was seen in the German press. For example, there were members of the Karen Ayesod that concluded that showing photographs of women with rifles of the kind that were frequently mocked in the Nazi German press were not to be used any further because it would paint, an even worse picture. So I want to conclude this with a few lessons that Zionist public relations agents learned during the 1930s and that we learn about them and their objectives. The 1930s clearly saw an increase in the understanding of photography as both an artistic and a political medium. At the center of the shift, not only for Jewish Palestine, stood photojournalism. International photojournalism offered channels through which images could flow freely and enter a variety of markets. Functionaries in Jerusalem observed this change and early tried to contribute news to the international market. What had not been possible during the 1920s now looked like it could be achieved. What was important for them was to get images flowing. This meant to invest in contacts, in the right bodies to do so, and also to create agencies, including Palcor. And preferably, agencies like Palcor were to have a good standing in the Jewish world, to be supported abroad, because the way Jews across the world could help heighten the visibility of Palestine in the news and facilitate a favorable image of the kind that Laurent, for example, did. So we see the more mobile these contacts were, including Laurent, who migrated, the more destinations could be reached. Through agents or editors, photographers or sellers of images, national borders became quite porous and permeable. But as much as Jerusalem attempted to centralize this making of news and views, it ultimately depended on the goodwill of others. Agents and editors not only turned pictures into commodities, but also rendered them political and social image acts that would ultimately oftentimes support domestic politics rather than the international image of Zionism. So the power ultimately was with the press. Local Zionist public relations experts both overestimated the power of visuals and underestimated the thought, work, and money that would have to go into their production and dissemination. And still, we see some trends arising. For example, we have in the early 1940s a new image, a new article on Palestine in Life magazine, this time titled Jewish Homeland, Palestine Wants a Million More Jews. It now displayed deeper knowledge of Zionist politics and drew stronger comparisons with American settlers of foregone centuries. Palestine was not an experiment anymore. It was now presented as a fact. So we see the image of the Jewish territorial nationalism was here again very closely connected with a global history of image circulation and the understanding of news and views. So many things have stayed the same. Other things have changed, of course. We have lost many of these mediators that I have talked about. They have disappeared in many ways, including through social media. Another thing that has changed is that images, while they could always be manipulated, can now be generated entirely artificially with the help of AI. And yeah, so it is in many ways our own responsibility to question what we can, we should, or we must do with these images. Every image is a potential political tool in a long history of hope and frustration. And that's a history that I'm very fascinated by and that I look forward to further exploring in the future. And this is where I would like to finish my talk and open this up for discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rebekka, for such fascinating insights into how visual images are crafted and curated to offer these very different perspectives on Jewish national identity. And I was really struck as you were speaking, as you were alluding to in your closing, by the vast gap between this visual culture where they're just beginning to discover how to use images as a political tool, and ours today where, and particularly at this moment where it feels like the stream of images is just completely unrelenting and completely overwhelming. It's not just created by professionals, and you know, it almost seems quaint, the notion of being able to take so much time to kind of curate and think about an image, although I guess that there are in different ways that kind of time and effort is still spent on images today, just in a very different way.
Yeah, thanks.
I've had a few kind of questions and comments come in. I'm going to start with just a comment from Eugene McConlow, which was sent to me privately. Comment rather than a question, but I thought worth reading out nonetheless. He says, the crucial importance of visual images in defining a nation's identity predates not only Israel, but perhaps even all nations as we now perceive them. Such images, both graphic and perhaps more frequently sculptural in earlier history, helped people to begin to share a constructed common identity. So such images reflected here in photojournalistic format have and surely inevitably will continue to shape our perceptions nationally and maybe internationally, our perceptions of common truths. There were a couple of general questions, which I will relate to you, but since they were not directly related to the topic of your talk, I think also fine, you can decide how much time you'd like to spend on them. I also have many more questions of my own directly related to the work that you presented. Someone was asking about the origins of the name Palestine, and also about the placement of the Zionist movement and its offices beginning in Berlin or in Central Europe, then switching to London, and then later switching to the United States. Maybe that says something about the mobility of the Zionist movement that you want to address. Maybe let's start with those and see if you'd like to say something.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I am particularly interested really by this comment that nations were always engaged in drawing and creating images and appearances of themselves. And that fascinated me from the beginning of my research with Palestine and with Zionism in particular, because when we think of the Mandate years, all of us, or at least those people who have dedicated some time to studying its history, then we have these very distinct images in mind that certainly also the Keren Kayemet and the Keren Hayesod created. And it's almost like we have a collective visual memory, at least in Israel, but also abroad, of the ever returning images. And what I understood in my research was that this was by no means an easy product of just some photographers going into the fields and taking photographs, but that was a very long process, and that this process was also full of conflicts. Like there are so many correspondences arguing whether you can show including like Arab Palestinians or not, whether you should show a lot of women or only a few women, in which way men should be shown, or children. So everything we see is not sort of haphazard. It is all part of a larger process. And I definitely agree that this is something that we can see in all nations. In a way, though, I am particularly interested by this Zionist process because it happened, it had to happen so quickly. They had to do some catching up because with a lot of other nations, including Germany, for example, this idea of what a German icon was supposed to be already existed. And of course, it was developed with the time. But with Zionism, I feel like they were feeling such pressure to create an image which could then be circulated. So it's interesting to follow their thoughts and conversations on why we don't have this image yet, and what it has to look like, and how it should be transferred abroad. So that's something I can say, for example. And yes, mobility was definitely a very important part, important element in this process, because it was never only about Palestine, it was also about the larger idea of Zionism and how to incorporate this into this national image. Yeah.
Thank you. So a question about the nature of how these images were created. How did photojournalism about Zionism reflect Jewish religious observance in the land of Israel at that time?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because Jewish religious observance was something that appeared before photojournalism, and that was often shown, for example, in the form of Jews praying at the Western Wall, which at the time was the space that we know now in front of the Western Wall was, of course, much smaller, but photographers were very interested in what was going on there. And we have different photo books, for example, which can in some ways be seen as the precursor to the photo essay that then appeared in photojournalistic publications. We have many photo books that show Jews praying at the Western Wall, and also observant Jews in other instances. And then what happened was that there was some kind of criticism, especially by Zionists, not surprisingly probably, of showing too much religion. And why are you not showing the building of settlements, the building of kibbutzim, of kutzot? Religion is kind of out, that's what they said. And you can still show them, but you always have to show them in combination with secular Zionism. That was very much their idea and their objective. And that was why they themselves, in creating these images, would reduce the amount of religious depictions, even though that later would then change again, especially after the Holocaust, for example. But during the 1930s and early 1940s, this was kind of a topic that was covered less.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, those conversations, I would be fascinated to hear the content of those conversations about what is the identity that the Zionists are wanting to craft using images. I mean, one of the things that really struck me as you were speaking is you talked about the images of atrocities very early on when you were talking about Hebron in 1929, and how the Keren Kayemet wanted to avoid those images of atrocity for more positive images and kind of diverting the gaze towards more positive aspects of life. And even there was that picture post, that picture post example that you gave us, which was in November 1938, and of course, and still then, there's very little about Jewish victimhood, which is, of course, later becomes a much more important part of Zionist and Jewish national identity. And I wondered whether you could say something about when and how that changes.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably changes only around the news trickling in from the Holocaust and from Europe. And then suddenly the image also changes in a way that it becomes much less experimental. During the 1930s, we have lots of immigrant photographers who come in and say, I want to work according to documentary photography. They take photographs of street life, for example. They don't really make a difference between Jews and other inhabitants of the land. It's in a way, it's this very alternative kind of way of seeing. But with the knowledge of the Holocaust that comes in, the focus moves again back to the kibbutzim or to Jewish life in general. And then we see, for example, Jewish soldiers on the front in North Africa, including women. Like, women are always then included in this. We have lots of women's organizations which were actually even more active in creating images of themselves and of Zionism, like a very active image of Zionism, including Vizo and the Women's Zionist Organization, or also Hadassah, showing images of themselves being active. Victims themselves, it's almost something that doesn't really, it's still there, even during the 1940s, when it comes to what happens in Palestine, it's not something that is being shown. Of course, photographs of the Holocaust are then at some point also circulated, but not in the same way. And for example, war victims for a long time are not shown. This only changes with the 1948 war, when it becomes clear that there will be a lot of victims, there are a lot of victims, and it's more careful reporting on wars, which we can see then. And then it's also a kind of photography that emerges that is very much subversive and critical of the larger, the broader, Israeli stance. At that point, then it's Israel, so it's also a different starting point for creating. I mean, it's almost like once Israel exists as a state, there is now a need to create a culture and an art that also is allowed to criticize.
A different kind of national narrative or discourse. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So I have lots and lots of questions, mostly sent to me, and I'm afraid we're running out of time. So I'm going to put just one of those to you that I received fairly early on, which was, and you mentioned women just now, but it was asking about female photographers. The photographers that you talked to us about were all men. Were there female photographers? To what extent did women play a role in crafting these national images?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So it's true that among the photojournalists, we have a lot of women, but with many of the photographers moving to Mandate Palestine in the 1930s, especially from Germany as emigres, we start having a lot of women who, for example, establish a tradition of a new studio photography. There is more family photography now, more children's photography. The child itself in these years moves more into the focus of societies generally, and therefore also of photography. And we have these children's studios, for example, but that doesn't mean that women only do domestic photography. The organizations that I mentioned don't only show women in the field, they also engage lots of women photographers. And in the late 1930s, we've actually a small photographers organization that emerges, and they want to defend their rights as freelancers in front, especially of the Zionist institutions, and among them are a lot of women as well. But we can also say that in some instances, photography serves women to survive until they find other means to do so. So in some instances, we have young women working as photographers. Until then, they settle down, they have families, and they stop taking photographs, which is an interesting development. And in other instances, we have women who move on. Generally, lots of photographers moved on after going to Palestine. After the war, they moved to other places. Among them, also lots of women. One of them that I write about in my book, for example, is Ellen Auerbach, but there are many others as well.
Thank you very much. And as always, apologies to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. There are generally more than we can handle. But those that were sent to the general chat, I will be able to get in the transcript of the talk afterwards, and I will send them on to Rebekka. So thank you very much for those. And it just remains for me to thank you once again, Rebekka, on behalf of the Sir Martin Gilbert Learning Centre, for such an engaging and fascinating talk. We very much look forward to seeing your book when it comes out. This is our last event for this winter term, 2023. But we have a very exciting lineup for next term, which we'll be sending out to all of you in an email in the next few weeks. So do keep an eye out for that. And in the meantime, if you've missed any of our talks, you can catch almost all of them on our YouTube channel. So we do invite you to go and do that. Wishing you all a good day, good evening. Thank you once again for joining us, and see you all again soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks also for the great questions.
Bye-bye.